Thanks, Liz. As Liz mentioned, what we're looking for here is feedback on a set of proposed good practice principles, in particular for the retirement phase modelling. We're conscious that there's quite a lot of activity in this area, as you can see in the program for this forum. So there's a lot of excellent thought going on. A lot of it is both the what and the how. Here we're concentrating on sort of the high-level principles that ultimately the Institute might support and help give consistency and a bit of guidance going forward. So over the next 3 months, we're looking to consolidate feedback and sort of refine a draft of these to get Institute support. And then perhaps over the next 12 months, we're looking to go a lot more into the detail, onto the how, which will obviously take quite a bit longer. One of the SPD objectives is to promote actuaries as expert in retirement income modelling and the models, and obviously the certification of models. One step towards this is to propose these good practice principles. At the moment, these are the work of Glenn and I, but once we get feedback, we'll hopefully get a lot more support. In putting them together, it's been a bit of a rethink of what retirees really need for models in the retirement phase. You know, retirement can go for 30 years plus, and it's not linear. It's not just, you know, a single spending level or return or, you know, lifespan. So I'll sort of, oh sorry, that's one I've just talked through. So retirement. In Australia, we're currently seeing about $35 billion move into the retirement phase each year. Retirees ultimately need to fund their lifestyle for an uncertain time frame. So common areas of advice that these models will need to answer would be things like, can I afford to retire? And if you think about the complexity to answer that question, it's quite frightening. So ultimately, a retiree or a retired household has an amount of capital that they need to amortise over uncertain market conditions, uncertain time frames, and what we've really delved into in this paper is the irregular cash flows that the age pension provides, particularly for people who are affected by the means testing. You know, this amortising of this capital has to sort of wrap itself around what the age pension provides in order to come up with, you know, a nice, sustainable lifestyle. So retirees need to make decisions about risk and reserving. And we feel that the techniques used to do this should be on par with standards used elsewhere in the finance sector. So there's a limit to the lifestyle that can be supported by any given amount of capital, and the consequences of ignoring that limit impact the whole industry. And in the paper, we do a bit of commentary on how and why. But ultimately, you know, we put a question to risk actuaries. You know, what would happen if retirees sue their advisors when they run out of money? Retirement models need to focus on the decisions retirees must make and the output that they need to see in order to make informed decisions. We've distilled the key drivers, we've distilled this into 8 key drivers that affect a retired household's financial outcomes. So they split into drivers that the retirees can control and those that they definitely cannot control, and then there's the ones in the middle which they have some influence over, but not always. As I said before, you know, retirees face considerable uncertainty, and if things go wrong in retirement, the only levers they've got at their disposal to improve their situation again will be to reduce their spending, carry out part-time work if they're able to, make changes to their investment mix potentially, or just simply accept more risk. Managing retirement in light of all this it's clearly a very actuarial problem. And as all actuarial students know, a financial entity needs reserves in order to survive in the face of risk. So the paper focuses on models that help households who self-insure all these risks, which is common practice in Australia, as to compared to using pooled products. Which brings us to our principle 1. So the model should provide information and outcomes that relate to the household's financial goals. So these retirement goals are at household level. It's often a couple, and it's typically a spending, a consumption goal. For example, the ASFA comfortable standard. It's an annual spending benchmark for life for the household. Things like the age pension are assessed at household level and take into account all assets and resources of the household. And then obviously the job of these retirement models are to support decision making in retirement and ultimately to optimise the household's consumption over their lifetime. So, in the paper we spend quite a bit of time looking at the uncertainties retirees face. Rather than assume averages, we advocate that proper allowance for risk is a critical part of the retirement phase decision making. So each line in this chart represents a forecast of how $100 might perform, if it were invested over each 10-year time frame since 1883. So some academics have put a paper together looking at equity returns right back to 1883, and obviously there's a bit of work and approximation involved, but what we've done is said, all right, if we invested $100, then in real terms, how would it have performed over each 10-year period? And you can see quite clearly, to use the average is just very sort of misrepresentative of what's going on, even over a relatively long time frame, like 10 years. So there's a number of ways that models can incorporate variability, and we're conscious that different actuaries will have different views and quite strong views on this. But some examples of how to incorporate variability in a model, an example is testing historic timeframes, as per the previous chart, fitting a distribution function to portfolio returns, but perhaps based on the asset mix, and using sophisticated economic scenario generators, which create sets of simulated future returns for each asset class and key economic indicators. So these charts are showing how a $1 million portfolio might perform in real terms based on two different investment mixes. So the top two charts are a defensive asset mix, and the bottom two charts are a balanced investment mix. On the left, the two charts are showing just a pure growth of the portfolio, and on the right, it's showing that again, assuming a $50,000 per year withdrawal is made, keeping pace with inflation. Now, the blue shaded area is showing percentiles, really. It's showing the range in which 80% of the simulations landed. So 10% of simulations, were popping above the line, potentially back down again, above the blue shaded area. And 10% would have gone below the blue shaded area. The green line represents the median. And this is all produced using an economic scenario generator. So you can see that taking withdrawals from a portfolio puts significant strain on financial resources. And that bottom right chart in particular, there's a 10% chance that the portfolio would run out completely by age about 85. And yet there's equally a 10% chance that it's still $1 million well into the household's 90s. So this brings us to our second principle. Models should be able to demonstrate the variability of future outcomes to facilitate informed trade-offs. The retirees need to trade off short-term lifestyle decisions or consumption decisions against the risk of running out later in life. Simply using fixed assumptions we think is misleading. 1 year mean variance optimisation techniques aren't really sufficient to take into account that risk. So what we believe is some sort of scenario testing or stochastic modelling is required. So I'll hand over to Glenn for his bit.
Thanks, Jim. One of the reasons that I'm very interested in this particular topic is obviously because I am retired, and the important point about retirement is it's all about consumption. And in looking at the consumption of a retiree, it's what I've found from a personal point of view is that there are some aspects of your consumption that are more important than other aspects of your consumption. For example, it's all very nice. You plan to have that luxury holiday every 2 years where you sort of go to Europe. You then find out that the share market plummets from 7,000 to 5,000, and suddenly that luxury holiday is off the planning. But there are other levels of consumption that are vital to you, and you want to make sure that you continue to be able to meet those expenses going forward. And so in terms of your projections, we need to handle that. Clearly that each individual will define what is essential differently. Some people will define essential as, I'm happy to live on the age pension, whereas someone else might define that I really need $70,000 of after-tax income to meet my essential needs. Once you've identified what these essential needs are, our position, or what we're saying, is that the discretionary expenditure, you're happy for that to be volatile and potentially you can't do it, but you need to actually ensure with a high degree of probability that you'll be able to meet your essential expenditure. And this sort of leads to our third principle, and what we've done is, you'll see we've highlighted the first part of the principle to look at this aspect of the principle, and that we believe that the projections have to allow for the fact that there are different types of expenditure, and the importance of those different types of expenditure vary from individual to individual. A lot of projections that you see out there basically just have one level of income, and they say that if you have this amount of assets, you can actually generate this level of income. What we're suggesting is that good projections should actually give you the ability to at least vary the level of income expenditure that you can have over the duration of the retirement. But as well as being able to have, say, at least 2 levels of expenditure over retirement, we believe that it's vital that the projection allows you to identify the essential level of expenditure and to ensure that that level of expenditure will be maintained throughout your retirement with a high degree of probability. In terms of projections, one of the aspects of the Australian system is that the age pension introduces interesting complexities into the projections that you actually prepare. If you look at the slide on the left, and you don't read what it is, basically that shows you that the proportion of the income in that particular example comes from the age pension. And you can see that it varies dramatically over the duration of that person's lifetime, and importantly increases quite significantly close to towards the end of that lifetime. So any modelling that you do has to allow for the complexity of the age pension. In developing projections, we also believe that there are segments of the retirees that have different needs in terms of the projection, and in the paper we go through in detail the 4 groups that we believe are important groups, and they basically vary from those people that virtually have no retirement assets, and therefore financial planning for them is that they'll just retire on the age pension. There's the group that has some retirement assets, but fundamentally it's not enough to really do anything other than meet special expenses after retirement. The third group is the group that we want to focus on, and I'll explore a little further, but that's where you've got enough retirement assets that you actually will be able to support a level of income expenditure that's greater than the age pension, but it's not sufficient to enable you to achieve everything you want to achieve. And then there's the fourth group, which is these are the rich buggers that can afford whatever they want, whenever they want it. The one that we feel is probably the most important and the most difficult from the point of view of projections is the segment 3. This is the people for whom their essential lifestyle exceeds the age pension. Now, if you look at that slide and without understanding exactly what it is, what the coloured columns give you is the impact of the different assets and the age pension on the income of that person. So although the income, you can see, which is basically the combination of all the columns, is reasonably constant throughout the person's retirement, you can see that the components that are in that vary over time and significantly different. Interestingly, you can see on the right-hand side that orange, little bit of orange there, that's basically where the income that's generated out of their assets are more than they actually need, and they actually have to go and invest it and generate an investment outside superannuation. So for this group, the modelling is quite complex. So what our fourth principle is that you actually have to project all significant assets, liabilities and incomes. Now, one of the issues that I see with a lot of the papers that on this issue of projecting benefits at retirement is that they seem to focus, well, not they seem, they do, they focus on the superannuation benefits. If you have a look at the calculators in the websites of super funds, it's all about what will happen if you put extra money into superannuation. That in terms of most households, or most people, they will basically be accumulating assets within superannuation, outside superannuation, and in fact, to optimise their ultimate retirement incomes, they will in fact have to invest outside superannuation. Potentially they'll have to borrow and God forbid, negatively gear assets, use the equity in their home. So it's important that any full projection actually looks at all of the assets of the individual and projects those forward. It also has to allow for debt. So if someone wants to be able to borrow money to invest in equities, you've actually got to be able to manage debt, and you've got to be able to manage debt in a way that is tax correct, handles the tax correctly. And importantly, the projection has to do all this at a household level. Again, if you look at the calculators that are generally available and websites and like, they're fundamentally projecting what's happening to individuals. As you're all aware, the age pension, for example, is very much dependent upon whether a person has a partner, living with a partner in a house, the personal circumstances of that, that the age pension for two people living together is less than the age pension for two single people. Obviously, the cost of living for a household, two people living together, is less than the cost of two people living separately. So in terms of a good projection, it actually has to look at the total household and project this as a group, and allow for the potential that obviously if you have a partnership situation where one of those partners actually dies. So principle 5 is that in terms of the projection, it actually has to look at all of the material all of the aspects that have a material impact on future outcomes. One of the problems I find with actuaries is that we get caught up in the detail, and we want to make sure that it does everything down to the nth degree. What we've got to be careful of, I like the term spurious accuracy. So where you don't, and typically, I'm sure those people involved in any project, you can probably get 80%, to get the last 20% of results often takes 80% of the work, and in a lot of cases that 20% doesn't have a material impact on the final outcomes that you're doing. So what you've got to do is, when you develop projection software, you actually have to look at the big drivers, the ones that make a difference, particularly in an environment where you're making assumptions about future investment performance, future inflation, where they're the biggies. And basically, you get one of those 1% out that makes a massive difference to your final results. And so what you've got to do is the projection. As you can see, we've split up the inputs into areas where where the retiree can actually have an impact. Doesn't have they must see it, and other ones where it's just in the black box and they just have to trust it. And just to finish my little section, the driver of every projection system, a good projection system, is to allow an individual to make informed decisions. Particularly that segment 3 is that, because the segment 3 people, they cannot have everything they want throughout their entire retirement. So they actually have to make choices about when they actually spend money. Do they spend money early when they're healthy? Do they save money for when if they live to long ages? The important thing, a projection software has to produce information and give them information to enable them to make decisions about what the outcomes or what the implications of expenditure decisions they make.
Okay, so Principle 6 now. So Principle 6, models should provide year-by-year projections of expenditure and assets. So I think by now this ought to be fairly obvious based on the detail we've gone through so far, in order to meet Principles 1 to 5. And the models need to be able to allow for changes in personal circumstances and expenditure levels over time. Given the length of retirement, people, one sort of story, I guess, is that retirees have an active phase, passive phase, and a frail phase. So, their needs over these different phases can be very different, and there's no reason why a model like this can't accommodate all of those. A model could also allow for one-off incomes, like receiving an inheritance, or one-off expenditures, like house renovations, things like that. Clearly, there's a significant amount of interplay between all these factors in retirement. Particularly the age pension, it absorbs quite a lot of risk. If your assets go down and you're in the means testing band, the age pension goes up, which can be quite material. Other dynamic sort of time-varying assumptions that the models should be able to handle is, say, on first death. So on first death, the needs of the household change, the age pension changes. So really a good model to help amortise capital ought to be able to deal with that. Then, in terms of building these models, models should use best estimates for all the required assumptions. And by that, what we're getting at is, so models should be free from bias. And by best estimates, we don't just mean using averages, obviously, but best estimates for all of the statistical properties of the distributions being used. Mean, variance, skewness, correlations, all of that. So the SPD are acutely aware that more effort is needed to sort of consolidate thinking on this and produce more guidance. We also need best estimate assumptions for things like fees and costs, as well as assumed changes to legislated bands and thresholds and age pension payment rates. So these assumptions can be time varying as well. So for a good example of that might be inflation and interest rates. So the assumptions for things like interest rates this year might be different to the assumptions in, say, 5 years down the track. And in setting assumptions like that, current market conditions can be taken into account, such as bond yield curves. Principle 8, now we're looking at longevity, or sort of mortality. So again, retirees face considerable uncertainty, as we've spoken about quite a lot today. Assuming a fixed age of death isn't sufficient. So the right-hand column here shows different percentiles for the joint life expectancy of a 65-year-old couple. And in putting these together, the figure that really jumped out at me was, there's a 90% chance that at least one of the couple will still be alive at age 85. And then when you sort of look further down that column on the right, there's a 25% chance one or more of them are still alive at age 96. And one thing that's really important to me is, a 25% chance doesn't mean probably won't happen. It means it will happen to 25% of retirees. And I think that's quite important. So the mortality rates should be appropriate for the clients of the model. So what we mean by that is different groups of retiree will have different longevity expectations. So I personally work quite a lot with self-managed superannuation funds, and we definitely see a wealth effect there. In the UK, there's an established market for impaired life annuities, and there's about 6 health factors that contain significant predictive power in terms of an individual's personal life expectancy. So these models should allow for both idiosyncratic risk, which is the chance an individual's experience differs to the table, and systematic risk, which is the risk that the whole table's wrong, that the improvement factors we're using aren't right. So principle 9. So it's clear retirees need to review their retirement decisions regularly as events unfold. If you kind of look forward, it's almost obvious, retirees are going to achieve returns that are below average about half the time. And that's not just, that's on a year-by-year basis. And as I mentioned before, 20% chance doesn't mean it probably won't happen. It means it will happen to 20% of people. So these retirees need to make decisions that are adaptive. As the experience unfolds, as their health status unfolds, as their own spending sort of impacts their capital, they need to be able to make decisions that reflect that. So ultimately, it lends itself quite well to the actuarial control cycle. To have, I think, we seem surprised that retirees all want to have buffers, but if you think about the risks they face, it's sort of obvious. So they need to hold these buffers and manage them. And that brings us to our last principle. Obviously, the models themselves need to be updated in order to make allowance for things like market conditions changing, market expectations changing, our mortality tables and improvement factors being updated and revised, and obviously legislation that impacts all the rules and taxes and age pension and all the things that have an effect on retiree outcomes. So, why actuaries? So actuaries are uniquely placed to consult, build and sign off these type models. Obviously we have the modelling expertise, the ability to explain difficult financial concepts. We've got the institute, which keeps us all in order. Experience and ability to apply control cycles, and obviously the international connection. So we can keep an eye on what's going on elsewhere in the world, and hopefully, absorb that into our thinking. In conclusion, the models, it's like Glenn was saying, that the models they need to shield the retirees from too much complexity, but instead focus on the decisions the retirees have to make and their goals and outcomes. I flew here yesterday from Hobart, so I don't need to know anything about what's going on inside the aeroplane or what's going on in the cockpit. I just need to make sure it arrives on time and I get here on time. Another conclusion is risk is a key part of retirees' decision making, and it's all very actuarial. Obviously, we've got further work, which we hope to get stuck into over the next 12 months. So these principles are really high level. They're about what these models have got to do. We'll spend quite a bit of time working on how. So for now, we're very interested in feedback on the models, so the principles themselves. In particular, if there's any people want to comment on or object to, my email is here, so I'm going to collect all that feedback on behalf of the SPD. And thank you.